the cradle of Northern Ireland's troubles. A place where even the name is disputed. Protestants call it Londonderry, Catholics call it Derry. "50 years ago, it was a battleground between Catholic citizens and the forces of the state. After 3 days of violence, the British Army was sent in to end the crisis.
Looking at this bridge, to me, it was like yesterday, except the background's different.
Well, I don't see it as being like yesterday. I can remember coming over the bridge.
Dave Moffat and Peter Blythe were the very first soldiers to enter the city in August 1969. Thousands more would follow.
Do you know what I'm getting now? I'm getting a picture in my head, and I feel like that ghost that was here before, where I can feel it. Can't you see the vehicles going down there in your head?
The army's stay was meant to be short. That's not how it worked out.
Looking back, it was momentous, really. And we wouldn't. Who thought it would go on for as long as it did actually go on?
The conflict would run across 4 decades, leaving lasting scars on Ireland and Britain, on places, and especially on people. This is the Great Hall at Stormont, the seat of government in Northern Ireland.
Just up there, hanging side by side, are portraits of 2 men who spent most of their lives trying to undermine government here.
Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness are honoured as the men who brought warring factions together. Paisley finished up as First Minister and a Lord, but at the outbreak of the Troubles, he was considered a dangerous Protestant dissident.
My memory is very clear that Paisley had supplied the money that financed the Kilkeel explosion.
McGuinness ended up as Deputy First Minister, but he started as an Irish Republican gunman and bomber.
Yeah, it's Martin McGuinness, handling weapons, a rifle and a revolver, and he's showing them bullets. No mask, nothing, weapons in the car, weapons hanging out of the car. This was incredibly common.
Dangerous radicals to elder statesmen. Their past shaped our present.
This is the story of their times. This is a secret history of the Troubles.
Is that the bar there? No.
That's the pub there, yeah.
Really? Wow.
Richard Leppington has walked this street only once before, more than 5 decades ago.
Martin Street just here now.
Wow.
The night he saw the murder that marked the very beginnings of the Troubles.
Jeepers.
The night he almost died.
I'm not real fond of being here. This is not good memories. God knows what would have happened if we just hadn't gone out for that drink that night.
In 1966, Northern Ireland was a place that seemed to be at peace. It was still more than 3 years before soldiers would arrive on the streets. Richard was 16 and worked in a Belfast hotel with his friend Peter Ward, who was 18.
Peter and I worked in what was called like the cocktail lounge. He was a good guy. He was a fun-loving guy, enjoying life. Until that day.
One night after work, Richard, Peter and 2 colleagues, all 4 Catholics, went for a late drink in a Protestant part of the city. They didn't imagine they were in any danger, but gunmen were waiting outside the bar.
We were leaving and going out the side door. It's a narrow door, so you go one at a time. I happened to be first. I actually couldn't tell you who was directly behind me or what, but the next thing, I heard bangs and flashes and heard someone yell, "Gun, run." So I was pretty fast down the street. And then I stopped, I walked back up again. I didn't get all the way up, but I can see across the street a guy lying on the ground, kind of in his legs up in the air, and a guy standing over him. So I just panicked, turned, ran back down. A lady came out of her house, brought me into her house. She saved my life. I'm ashamed to say I don't even know her name. Don't even know her name. I'm sure I knew it then.
When did you see Peter again?
That night was the last time I saw Peter alive. The next time I saw him was in an open casket at his mother's house. Probably for a few seconds because I couldn't look very long at it.
Peter Ward was one of 3 people killed that month in a sudden spate of attacks on Northern Ireland's Catholic minority. The attacks came from a militant Protestant group, motivated by fears of being overwhelmed by Catholic Ireland. They called themselves the Ulster Volunteer Force. The Northern Ireland Prime Minister Terence O'Neill acted decisively.
In Belfast, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland announced the outlawing of the so-called quasi-fascist organisation, the Ulster Volunteer Force. But how safe is it for the Queen to visit Belfast next week?
Days after the UVF killings, Terence O'Neill welcomed the Queen for what he hoped would be a healing royal visit. But historic tensions were coming to the surface. It is just about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 4th of July when the Queen's motorcade turned this corner in the city centre. What happened next was a crime that was almost unheard of in the United Kingdom, an attack on the person of the monarch. A concrete block was thrown onto her car by a young Catholic building worker. An angry crowd wanted him lynched. He was later jailed for 4 years for treason. The events of those weeks were a reminder that Northern Ireland was defined by sectarian division and distrust, best expressed by a former Northern Ireland Prime Minister.
The fact is that the Roman Catholic, by and large, is out to destroy Ulster and bring it into a united Ireland. The Protestant is out to maintain Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom.
Northern Ireland had been born in blood. When the rest of Ireland broke away from Britain in the early part of the 20th century, Belfast had been consumed by sectarian violence between the majority Protestant population, mainly British Unionists, and Catholics who were mainly Irish nationalists. The Northern Ireland state that emerged from that conflict was built on division. It was designed to have a permanent Unionist majority. From the first, it was a one-party state. The Unionist Party always had control. But by 1966, the Catholic population was growing and wanting to assert itself. That year also saw celebrations of the 50th anniversary of Ireland's Easter Rising rebellion, a reminder that many had no loyalty to the Northern Ireland state. More fuel for Protestant fears. By almost every measure, nationalists in Northern Ireland were second-class citizens in housing, jobs and politics.
I fought for 18 years in the army for liberty and freedom, but simply because I'm a Catholic I can't get freedom.
Derry was the most blatant example of how Unionists kept nationalists out of power.
The total Unionist vote in Londonderry is 9,000. And these votes put a total of 12 members in the City Council. The total Nationalist vote is 14,000. And these votes put in 8 members. Now note the curious situation. Most of the voters in Londonderry are Nationalist, but the council is controlled by the Unionists.
Terence O'Neill had seen a need for reform. In his view, the Catholic population could no longer be ignored.
You're feeling good, thank you. I'm getting first class, all. Thank you very much. More than 50% of the school children in Northern Ireland today are Roman Catholics. It seems to me that if Northern Ireland's future is going to be guaranteed in the United Kingdom, then you must have a more united society in Northern Ireland.
He was wise enough to see that that couldn't go on indefinitely. So, he thought about ways you could create a better relationship with the nationalist part of the community.
As a citizen, I thought his heart was in the right place. I mean, I think there was a feeling that change was long overdue. But given that there was always going to be resistance to change, if you ask yourself, is he the guy who will be able to stand up to that resistance? I think a lot of people had their doubts.
The face of that resistance was Ian Paisley, a charismatic, fundamentalist Protestant minister who preached on the perils of Catholicism, Irish nationalism, and the policies of Terence O'Neill. Policies that Paisley believed would open the gates to Irish Republicans.
You're going to hear the marching feet of Protestants on the march.
I and many others at the time underestimated him. We just thought this is a big, noisy, booming cleric, you know, and it's a flash in the pan, you know, what will it amount to?
Paisley led his own small church, but his political message found a wider congregation. Opposition to O'Neill became an evangelical mission for Paisley's followers, like the Reverend Ivan Foster.
My friend Mr. Foster must speak to you now.
It's O'Neill, the dictator, that is breaking up the view that the world held of Ulster.
Terence O'Neill was saying we have been wrong as unionists up to now. We've got to change our whole attitude and change our notions and change our views and alter everything. Well, I didn't like being told that my father and my grandfather and my forefathers before them had been wrong.
By the mid-60s, without standing for any political office, Paisley was becoming O'Neill's most powerful opponent. He'd created a movement built on Protestants' traditional anxieties. As his rhetoric continued to stoke those fears, the authorities became increasingly alarmed. Publicly, O'Neill's government dismissed Paisley as a booming cleric. But their secret assessment has been locked away for decades in the Public Records Office. This is what the Unionist government really thought of Ian Paisley. We can reveal that beginning in 1966, O'Neill had police record Paisley's speeches and sermons in their entirety, intending to prosecute him for inciting opposition to the Northern Ireland government.
We are told that if we take out God's word and give a message from God's word, we're liable to be prosecuted and we're liable to find ourselves once again incarcerated in the prison house of Captain O'Neill, the traitor and the Lundy.
Amen. No coopering. The hell with coopering.
Paisley had been jailed briefly for riotous assembly. But O'Neill's government suspected he was doing more than just rabble-rousing.
This is a police intelligence report into what it calls the Paisleyite movement. In here we find a list of organisations it says were directly linked to Ian Paisley, including a secret militant wing, the Ulster Volunteer Force. As far as the authorities are concerned, Paisleyism and the UVF are the one and the same.
Ian Paisley denied the connection to the UVF, but subsequent events showed there was more to his relationship with the group that killed Peter Ward than just suspicion. Unfortunately for Terence O'Neill and his brand of polite unionism, he was caught between Protestant cries of betrayal and a new political force, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. Though a magnet for Catholics who were not prepared to settle for second-class citizenship, it was not a nationalist organisation, and it had many Protestant supporters. It included people who wanted to reform Stormont, but also those who wanted to see Stormont fall. Almost inevitably, the campaign centred on Derry. Civil rights protesters planned a march to the centre of the city. Even as Terence O'Neill was proclaiming a new era of tolerance, his government banned the march. A ban that would be enforced by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, an overwhelmingly Protestant police force. The main organiser was prepared for blood.
I knew what was going to happen. I wore a new suit and I bought 6 white hankies. Brand new white hankies. 2 side pockets of the coat, 1 here and 1 side to act as bandages.
So you wanted a confrontation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because what other alternative was there?
The march was blocked by the police. There was a brief standoff before the police acted. The pictures of the police violence were seen across the world. The attention transformed the civil rights movement.
Did you think that was a turning point?
Yes, and I said, I said, when our blood flows, Stormont goes, it's finished. And it had to happen.
A few hundred people had mustered for the banned march. A month later, more than 10,000 turned up to another march that was not so easily restrained.
Did you see those images at the time, and what did you think? Did you understand? Did you have any sense of how they were going to play out around the world?
Well, I realised it was very bad publicity for Northern Ireland, violence on the streets and confrontations with our police service. If you're having a parade like this led in many cases by active Republicans, it was provocative to the Unionist community in those areas.
Republicans, including members of the illegal Irish Republican Army, had helped set up the civil rights movement. That was enough to convince many Unionists the campaign was just a front.
The whole Civil Rights Association is a front movement for the destruction of the Constitution of Northern Ireland.
But civil rights leader John Hume insisted their non-violent campaign threatened no one.
The civil rights movement most emphatically is not out to upset the Constitution of Northern Ireland. We are out for civil rights, for equal rights for all citizens within the Constitution. In fact, we are testing the strength of this Constitution.
What few realised was that as well as being a test for Stormont, the civil rights movement was also a test for the IRA. The IRA had tried and failed to bring down the Stormont government before. Its last campaign collapsed in 1962. A new IRA leadership saw the civil rights campaign as an opportunity to build a broadly based socialist movement. But there was another faction who wanted to go on fighting the British and saw it as a stepping stone to a united Ireland. At that point, Des Long was already one of the IRA's veterans.
Unionists will say the civil rights movement was, by and large, a front for the IRA.
It wasn't. It wasn't a front for the IRA. You had people in it who were never in the IRA. Hume and a few of his cronies, they were never in the IRA. But then you had people in it who were IRA. I saw it as another wing and helping people to oppose British rule. Every fella gets his head cracked open by a peeler's baton is a potential recruit.
The civil rights campaign sparked a political awakening for many. Among them, Martin McGuinness, one of the future leaders of the IRA. As 1968 turned to 1969, battle lines were being drawn on traditional terms. Protestant, Catholic, Unionist and Nationalist, orange against green.
Ulster stands at the crossroads. I must say to you this evening that our conduct over the coming days and weeks will decide our future.
But even as he spoke, the very ground was shifting under the Prime Minister, Terence O'Neill. His promises of a programme of reforms were cautiously welcomed by many. But they were not enough for the most strident campaigners. And they were too much for many thousands of Unionists. The pressure only intensified when Ian Paisley stood for election against O'Neill himself. The Prime Minister won, but narrowly.
Our Prime Minister has returned once again.
He's afraid to come to the...
That would have been a sad day. That would have been a sad day.
Humbled, O'Neill didn't turn up to hear the result.
No, because you couldn't. You haven't proof on your side.
I have proof on my side.
The historic suspicions and fears of unionism were punching through to the surface. Betrayal and treachery were the catchwords.
Friend, he's passing away. You're seeing his dying kicks, the dying kicks of O'Neillism. Yes. I'm not referring to his person.
Into this feverish political atmosphere, in March 1969, the start of a mysterious bombing campaign that appeared to confirm O'Neill had been reckless with his reforms. Electrical and water installations were targeted. The prime suspects were the IRA. One of the first explosions was at Silent Valley, a reservoir near Kilkeel, County Down.
My memory is April 69. There was a loud bang in Silent Valley.
David Hancock was part of the permanent army garrison in Northern Ireland and was stationed nearby.
We heard it. And then the British Army was deployed to guard vulnerable points. I think it was a week later, I was lying in bed and bang, and I said to my then wife, that's Annalong Viaduct gone. And they'd blown up Annalong Viaduct. The IRA immediately got the blame, but it did not have the footprint of the IRA.
So how are you feeling today, sir? Very well indeed, thank you.
O'Neill's own party believed he had lost control.
Oh, well, it just became obvious that it was necessary to take this move.
What are you going to do? At the end of April, he resigned.
I can have a little rest. No, I'm not going to retire from politics, no.
Later, he would learn that the bombings had been designed to force him out, and that they were not carried out by the IRA, but by the UVF, part of a plot to hurt him and stop concessions to Catholics. The authorities didn't say it publicly, but they suspected Paisley was involved.
I was good friends with the district inspector down at Kilkeel, And he showed me the evidence that they had of the involvement of money from Paisley into what was then called the UVF, where they got the explosives from, how it was carried out, who did it, and why. My memory is very clear from what the district inspector in Kilkeel told me, was that Paisley had supplied the money that financed the Kilkeel explosion.
What was the demonstration you were talking about on Saturday, Mr. Paisley?
A demonstration demonstrating the tyranny of O'Neillism.
Well,
I'd certainly like to be out for that. I'm now under arrest.
Ian Paisley was in jail for another public order offence when the bombs went off. But did he have a role in them? Extraordinarily, the first concrete information came from one of the bombers. Paisley's own bodyguard, Samuel Stevenson. In late 1969, he secretly met Nationalist MP Austin Curry to warn that the bombing campaign was about to be renewed.
This man and I met, and he said that they were responsible for those explosions which was supported by Paisley. He then went on to say that they would take action in the Free State. And he told me that an electricity pylon at Ballyshannon would be blown.
Did he say when it would be blown?
The following weekend. And he also told me that he was supposed to go, but he would try to get out of it. But certainly one of them would be Thomas McDowell from Kilkeel.
What happened a couple of days later?
What happened? The explosion. As it so happened, McDowell electrocuted himself.
Thomas McDowell was found dying, wearing a coat with a UVF insignia. He is buried behind one of Paisley's Free Presbyterian churches, commemorated as a member of one of his political organisations, the Ulster Protestant Volunteers.
I have no doubt that men who came together maybe to form the UVF would have been under the influence or had been in contact with the general witness and stand of our protest against O'Neill and all the rest of it. But if they decided to put the views that we were expressing into actions of their own, that's not our fault. They were wrong. They were wrong. And somebody deceived them into thinking that what they were doing was right.
Ian Paisley always denied any connection to the bombings, but he couldn't deny his association with the bombers.
Involved with me, I don't know whether you can say that or not, but they were in organisations that I was leading. That is right, but I mean, I can't be responsible for everybody who is a member of a church that I pastor or an organisation which I lead.
Tensions only escalated through the spring and early summer of 1969. 2 Catholics were killed by police in separate incidents, and rioting became commonplace. The tinder for an almighty fire was piling up. The matches were struck in August. Severe rioting began in Derry after a Loyalist march. It became known as the Battle of the Bogside. The rioting lasted 3 days. The unrest spread to other towns, but it became acute in Belfast, where Protestant and Catholic districts were right next to each other. On the 14th of August, guns came out. After a Protestant man was killed by a Republican gunman, police opened fire with a heavy machine gun.
The small shooting war had begun. 4 people shot dead in Belfast, including a 9-year-old boy sheltering in his own home.
9-year-old Patrick Rooney was killed inside his family's flat. His father's final interview about the killing was recorded shortly before he died in 2013.
I was thrown against the wall, and the bullet came right through the wall, right through. The walls were like paper, you know. The walls were all, they weren't brick walls. And I got grazed on the side of my head, and I started to bleed. So the way that I thought Patrick had fainted at the idea, you know, we got slumming down the wall in the blood, and next thing he slid down the wall. Brains were blew out. Brains were scattered all over the wall. He was 9.5 years of age. 9.5.
The subsequent public inquiry found the killing deepened the fateful split between Catholics and police. The spread and the extent of the rioting had exhausted the Royal Ulster Constabulary. The Stormont government was forced to ask London to send in troops. Soldiers Dave Moffat and Peter Blythe led the advance guard that rolled into Derry 50 years ago.
We're going into the unknown.
How did the local people greet you when you came in?
As if we were rescuing them.
Yes, yeah. It was a nice feel. I suppose we felt a bit.
It was.
I hate to say liberators, but the rioting stopped.
The ladies were coming down, all right, boys, and they were, you know, do you want a cup of tea? Which is a good thing to say to a Yorkshireman, isn't it? And that's the kind of thing that was happening. And then on the other side of the road, you're seeing all these guys march down in the RUC uniforms, covered in muck. Obviously shattered, tired. And it was a defeated look.
They moved straight into one of the worst hit streets on the edge of the bogside, carrying with them their ready-made barbed wire barricades and lining up in battle formation across the street where the air was foul with smoke and tear gas.
The good thing about it, it stopped. I can't speak for the RUC, I'm not sure they were all that pleased to see us because I think they expected us to take their sides against the opposition.
What you just said there, the RUC, you're quite right, they thought we were going to come in hard.
Yeah.
Whereas the people didn't.
The public who'd been rioting were great. They were pleasantly surprised and relieved.
Did you have any sense of how seismic this moment was at that time, or even in the immediate aftermath?
I did not think it would become what it became.
We didn't expect it to go on.
And to develop like it did.
We thought we'd ended it. It came in and it stopped.
The troops were greeted by Derry's nationalists as protectors. Shane Paul O'Doherty, who would later become an IRA bomber, was then a teenager.
It was over, like the complete chaos had just ended in a moment, you know. And you know, we were running messages for the soldiers, like getting them cigarettes at the shops, bringing them back their change, you know. We were bringing them sandwiches. There was a sense of exhilaration, they were here.
The arrival of the troops brought a respite, but not a solution.
Thank you. That's for after your lunch or after your dinner.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thousands had been forced out of their homes by the violence. The new Northern Ireland Prime Minister, James Chichester Clark, blamed the IRA.
Quite clearly, we confront here a deliberate conspiracy to subvert a democratically elected government. No doubt that Ulster faces today the most serious and malevolent threat in its history. We will resist it by every means in our power.
The IRA had taken part in the violence, but did not control it, as the Prime Minister claimed. IRA gunmen opened fire that night, but proved unable to stop all attacks, including the burning down of one entire street of Catholic homes. Some residents there saw the violence as a failure by the IRA to defend nationalists.
Blame the IRA. There's no IRA that I know of about, but I wished I had been an IRA woman. I would have been here on the spot and had a machine gun.
Over the following weeks, tension remained, but it seemed that the worst had passed. The army had averted civil war, and more reforms began to roll out. Those included plans to disarm the RUC and disband an auxiliary police force known as the B Specials. Loyalists on Belfast's Shankill Road responded by attacking the very forces they had always considered their own.
The Battle of the Shankill was renowned in the British Army because it was the first time any of us, and we've been fired at in a few places around the world, had been fired at by people carrying the Union Jack. It was a bizarre experience. We could see the flags being flown, and we could hear the shots being fired, and sometimes we could hear the ricochets not being that far from us. It was surreal.
Tear gas was used, and it was after that that the first shots were heard. A policeman was hit by one of these shots and killed.
Loyalists had responded to policing reforms by killing a policeman, a fellow Protestant, Constable Victor Arbuckle. He was the first RUC officer to die in the Troubles. Loyalist gunmen also wounded 16 soldiers. The army fired back. Herbert Haw and his cousin George Dickey were shot dead. The two Protestants were the first to be killed by the British Army in Northern Ireland, in circumstances that were far from clear.
Did soldiers under your command have anything to do with that?
They might have. It was very difficult to know. It was a gun battle, and we had to obey the law. They didn't. And so we had to make sure that we were acting lawfully. They were opening fire at anything they chose.
The army claimed both men had guns, but there was no supporting evidence. In fact, by the time the inquest was held, the army had changed its story. Herbert Haw had been shot because he was a petrol bomber. May Elwood is his sister.
Immediately afterwards, they said they shot a man who was firing a rifle.
A gun at them. He had a gun.
And then at the inquest, they said he had a petrol bomb.
Oh, he was well armed, wasn't he? He was shooting them and he was throwing petrol bombs at the same time. What were they trying to say? They were trying to cover up for what they had done.
What did they do that night as far as you're concerned?
Murder. Oh, it was definitely murder. I would say Herbie and Geordie were both murdered that night. I had to show something for their day of widespread rioting.
The Army's hard-hitting military action was welcomed by some Belfast Catholics.
When we went back to our Roman Catholic schools where we were living, we were given cups of tea, and actually in a couple of streets we were cheered. The British Army cheered in a Roman Catholic area because they felt that we had acted for the good.
But relations were about to enter a new phase. Irish Republicans predicted the honeymoon period would eventually end, but some were determined to speed that process along. The very presence of British troops aggravated divisions developing in the IRA. Most of the leadership wanted to continue their push into socialist politics, but others believed the time was ripe for armed rebellion. That December, the Republican militants drove to the town of Athlone, in the centre of the island of Ireland, to form a breakaway group, the Provisional IRA. The meeting that took place has remained secret until now. This is the house where the Provisional IRA was formed a few days before Christmas in 1969. A couple of dozen Republicans gathered for a meeting that would change the course of Irish history.
We met in a house belonging to a fellow called Victor Fagg. And Victor Fagg was an IRA man, Protestant IRA man, who had a place in Athlone, and we set up a Provisional Army Council.
Can you describe the mood that evening as you all met?
Elation. We had made a split at last. Like, it's high time to move away from these fellas. We knew we had a huge job in front of us, but we were quite prepared to do it.
The leadership of the new IRA devised a three-point plan. First, they would defend Catholic areas. Second, they would carry out retaliatory action. And third, when ready, they planned all-out war against the state. At that stage, Northern Ireland had returned to a relative calm. That would soon change.
"1970 comes around. What is the IRA about at this point, the Provisional IRA?
Recruiting and arming.
It's not about actually carrying out attacks at this point?
Well, of course you would carry out attacks if you could. Great way of recruiting is attacks. It attracts people if you're successful. It would be on training people, preparing people, because you were getting people in who didn't understand weapons or didn't know about them and would have to be trained in training camps and that kind of thing.
The age of tea and biscuits came to an end in April 1970, after a perennial source of dispute, a march by the Protestant Orange Order in Belfast.
There'd been, I think, an Orange March. The troops on the ground were the Royal Scots, and the Roman Catholic community regarded them as Protestant. And so they started to throw milk bottles, rocks, and oppose them and try and turn the old jeep over. We could hear the Royal Scots were getting quite a hiding up on the Ballymurphy Road. We tried very hard to calm the situation down. It was a very difficult evening, but we knew that from then on, for us as the Residence Battalion, that night was the turning point. It was the night the local people turned against the British Army.
The IRA had yet to stake their claim as the defenders of their people. 3 months later, after another Loyalist parade, came an opportunity. When rioting appeared to threaten a Catholic enclave in East Belfast, IRA gunmen opened up and shot dead 2 Protestant civilians. One of them, a father of 4.
The people that I have shopped with, I feel nothing for those people but hatred and bitterness. For they took our home that was so happy and full of love. Our children, my husband and I, lived for each other. They shattered not only my husband's lives, but the lives of myself, my children, and my unborn baby. And those people, those non-violent, peace-loving Catholic people, that's what they did to us. And to my dying day, I won't ever forgive them.
Protestants remember it as a sectarian attack on their community. In Republican lore, it is known as the Battle of St. Matthew's. The IRA, in their telling of it, had successfully repelled the attackers. Part 1 of their plan complete. With their guns, the IRA had positioned themselves as protectors of nationalists. Whether the army knew it or not, they were in the process of establishing themselves as the enemy. On the 3rd of July, the army moved to search one house in the Falls Road area of Belfast for weapons. But after a confrontation with local people, an army commander decided to escalate the operation, and the entire area was sealed off. In an unprecedented action, the army then declared a curfew, effectively locking thousands of people into their own homes.
For the first time in nearly a year, the troops in Ulster were this weekend allowed to get tough. Their days of standing on the corners to take a bashing from both the mobs and the politicians might be over.
More than 100 guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition and explosives were found by the army. But 4 civilians were killed by soldiers, most of them shot for being outdoors during what became known as the Falls Curfew. 18-year-old Joe Clark was a mechanic, obsessed with motor racing and little else.
If you went into the lower falls, which I did, and it's still, I regard myself as a child at the time, going in and being totally shocked with the devastation of the place, and thinking, something has to be done here, this can't go on.
At the end of the Troubles, the army produced a report that concluded that the Falls Road curfew was one of the most serious mistakes they made in the entire conflict. Many Catholics, the report says, decided that the army was pro-loyalist, and as a result, the IRA gained significant support.
I think people's attitude towards the British soldiers started hardening then, and it was, okay, you want to mess us about, we start messing you about, and that's what you did, you know. You went into rats and you threw bottles and stones and stuff like that there, and you thought you were getting your own back on them, and it just escalated from there.
Shortly afterwards, Joe Clark joined the Republican movement. He wasn't alone. The IRA now moved to the second stage of their plan. They went on the attack. 2 policemen were killed in a bomb attack in South Armagh. At the start of 1971 in Belfast, gunner Robert Curtis was shot dead, the first soldier killed by the IRA.
I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that there'd been no other soldiers shot. There's never been a serious trouble as that before. And I thought we'd made a mistake. I said, it can't be. Soldiers don't get shot in Northern Ireland.
In March 1971, it became clear that there would be few ground rules in this new offensive. The IRA lured 3 Scots soldiers, Dougal Mackay and teenage brothers John and Joseph McCaig, from a bar in Belfast and shot them dead by the side of a road. Any soldier, even off-duty, unarmed and in civilian clothes, was a target of the IRA's offensive.
So how are you? Oh, get living, you know.
Tommy Anderson could have been in their place. He was out in the bars of Belfast on the same day his 3 comrades were killed. A little later, he was burying his friends.
We were told to go up to the graveside one at a time, and that was the hardest part for me. Because when you went up there, you were standing facing the families, and the families were breaking their heart. And you were standing at this side, looking down at the coffin, and they're all hugging each other. And it was heartbreaking, you know what I mean? So you saluted, and while I was saluting, the tears just, they couldn't stop, they just came out. Don't get me wrong when I say this. I think there wasn't one man in our platoon that didn't want to throttle everybody in Northern Ireland. And I mean everybody. Because these were our mates, our brothers.
The killings were a turning point for soldiers on the streets.
It was to make the army think they weren't just fighting IRA. They were fighting the Catholic people. They were definitely sending a message that nobody was safe out.
In that climate of anger and fear, soldiers from the same regiment had little restraint on the streets in the following weeks. Catholic people witnessing such behaviour could not regard the British Army as protectors. The Troubles were well and truly underway. Death and mayhem had become routine. The Unionist government under Prime Minister James Chichester Clark could not cope, as a familiar adversary, now a Westminster MP, was keen to point out.
It will come as a shock that the Prime Minister has simply nothing, that he stands in the face of the most serious crisis Ulster has ever known, absolutely paralysed.
Chichester Clark resigned. His successor as Prime Minister, Brian Faulkner, thought he had a shortcut to bring Northern Ireland back to stability. Faulkner's plan was internment, the mass arrest and detention of IRA suspects without trial. In decades past, it had worked to disable the IRA when it had been introduced on both sides of the border. But this time, Dublin had made it clear the South would not take part. In August 1971, Faulkner flew to London to persuade Downing Street to approve his plan.
I remember very well the meeting with Brian Faulkner, and there was a good deal of reluctance to contemplate internment north of the border without anything south of the border. But Brian Faulkner represented that it was absolutely essential and made it pretty clear that he would not feel able to continue if his wish to have internment was not granted.
But Faulkner was also raising the stakes. Failure would increase the likelihood that the British government would step in to suspend Stormont and rule directly from London.
I think it was made clear that, you want internment. We're very dubious about it, but, you can have your internment. But if that still doesn't stem the problem, there are other steps we may very well have to take.
I have therefore decided, after consultation with Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom, to exercise, where necessary, the powers of detention and internment vested in me as Minister of Home Affairs.
Operation Demetrius, internment, was launched on the morning of the 9th of August.
I had been down the Lower Falls rioting, and I went back home, and I didn't get into the house till about 4 o'clock in the morning. And at 4:30 the knock came, and my father says, Joseph, I think that's the soldiers. I said, well, let them in. And they came in and they searched the house. It was paratroopers, all paratroopers. And they weren't rough or ignorant or aggressive in any way. And at the end, they just said, Joseph Clark. And I said, that's me. He says, you'll come with us. And it was a captain of the parachute regiment. He says to me, if you try to escape, you'll be shot dead. And my father says, he'd not try to escape.
On the first day of internment, 342 people were arrested, all of them regarded as suspected Republican terrorists. No loyalists were detained. Four days of violence followed. 24 people were killed. The parachute regiment was blamed for almost half the deaths.
What did it feel like when the big shooting really started earlier on this week? Did you think it was a great sense of relief for everybody?
Oh, me, yeah. It was real whoopee, you know. Everybody started letting off rounds. It was really great. It was fine. It was no blow.
Ultimately, internment was considered a failure. Many detainees had no involvement in violence, and the leadership of the IRA largely evaded arrest. The Army has always said the decision to introduce internment was Faulkner's and not based on its advice. But we now know the most notorious part of the operation had been planned by military intelligence. A secret interrogation centre had been built months before at an old airfield on the north coast. 14 internees were singled out and flown there by helicopter. They would spend the next 7 days wearing hoods, deprived of sleep, undergoing what was called deep interrogation. Joe Clark, then 19, was one of those men.
We're taken out and put into this room, spread eagled, fingertips up on the wall, feet out, and you would stand there for a while. And if you try to move your hands or your feet, if you moved your hands, your hand was beat until you put it back in the proper position. If you moved your feet, the inside of your legs, inside of your feet were kicked until eventually my feet were twice the size they normally were, and the inside of them were totally bruised, black and blue. I just couldn't comprehend why this was happening to me, or how people could do this to other people. I just couldn't fathom this at all.
You were an active Republican.
I was 19 at the time. I hadn't been in the Republican movement a long time. I wasn't, I would say I wasn't a dangerous person.
Nine days after his initial arrest, Joe Clark was taken back to an ordinary prison.
I couldn't believe it. A week had passed when I left there. A senior prison officer came in. I knew his name was Dickie Elder, and I know to be called Dickie Elder. And he says to me, "Where were you?" I says, "I don't know." He says, "What do you mean you don't know?" I says, "I had a hood over my head." I said, "You had a hood over your head?" And he patted me in the head and he says, "You're all right now. Nothing will happen to you. You're among men now." And I got very emotional at this. I can actually feel myself getting emotional now thinking about it. But it was the first kind words, genuine words of compassion or whatever, was said to me in 9 days.
The interrogation methods were later found to be illegal under British law. The European Court found that they didn't constitute torture, but were cruel and inhumane. Britain's reputation had been damaged, and for very little return. David Ramsbottom was then the military aide to the head of the British Army.
I saw some of the take from some of the people who were subject to the deep interrogation process, and some of them had nothing to say because they had nothing to say. It was not a good operation. It turned the whole of the Catholic population, the Republican population, against us, and they left us in no doubt at all when we were operating on the streets that we were regarded as the enemy.
Internment didn't destroy the IRA, it strengthened the IRA. Deaths multiplied in the final months of 1971 as the IRA's campaign built up. The IRA was able to hide within the local population, so measures to counteract them often seemed repressive, or worse. At the start of November, during a search operation in West Belfast, a soldier fired a single rubber bullet. Emma Groves was blinded while standing in her own living room. A future Prime Minister of Ireland warned that the army were helping the IRA realise their plans.
initiated this campaign in February 1970 with the clear intention of forcing a British reaction. The British Army are doing exactly what the Provisional IRA planned they would do, falling completely into the trap, and the British government's inability to control this has made a political solution almost impossible of achievement now.
That warning went unheard. The ITV programme in which it was made was never broadcast. Banned by the Independent Television Authority, in part because it showed the Chief of Staff of the Irish Republican Army signalling the final phase of the plan: all-out war.
The army in the north has come through a tough new phase. Battle-hardened, ready to stand up to the hardships of the final phase, which of course will be more intensive than anything experienced so far.
2 years after the Provisional IRA was formed, the destruction of Stormont was in its sights. Shane Paul O'Doherty, the Derry Catholic who'd once run errands for soldiers, now lives in Spain. But in 1971, at the age of 16, he had become an IRA bomber, part of the all-out assault to bring down the state.
I remember evenings from Craigan when, 3, 4, 5 or 6 of us were sent out with girls to plant bombs, and this went on, it seems in my memory, for weeks, and we just walked bombs into the city centre. There was only a 3-minute fuse on these things. And when you and the girl went into the doorway pretending to kiss or whatever it was, you'd light the fuse with a box of matches. You'd strike the matches along the box along the matches on the fuse, it would fizz. And you'd only a 3-minute walk away when these things went off, so you'd see them going off, and it would destroy the front of the shop or building or the bank.
The British had plans of their own. General Sir Michael Carver, the most senior officer in the army, wrote this secret memo after visiting Northern Ireland in December 1971. In it he said that the time had come for London to meet the demand of nationalists and curb the powers of the Stormont government. General Carver said there was a danger of inflaming the Catholic population, so he recommended that the army should engage in rather less provocative activity, particularly in Derry. General Carver's recommendations can't be reconciled with what happened next. In the new year of 1972, the Army deployed the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, described as shock troops, to Derry. In late January, they joined soldiers sent to control a march against internment along a beach outside the city. Rubber bullets were fired almost immediately. The army action now provoked even moderate nationalists, like the local MP, John Hume.
But I wouldn't be very proud of the conduct of your men today. They're proud of people, and they're totally unarmed people, as you can see for yourself.
If you lead all people away, then we'll go away too.
Yeah, but we want to march in there.
Well, I'm allowed to march in here.
Why not? It doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to you. You can't prohibit it.
You're here by your government.
Whose government?
The government of Northern Ireland.
Not our government. And that's why you're here, because it's not our government.
There had been an incident at McGilligan where one para had behaved very badly. Suddenly one para appeared and they took action which caused the commanding officer of the 2nd Green Jackets to ring me up and say that he was very worried about these people coming into Londonderry because they didn't act as people should if they realised the sensitivities of acting in Londonderry.
How did he describe them?
He described them as hooligans in uniform.
It was soldiers from that very same 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment that were sent to Derry to enforce a ban on a planned civil rights march 8 days later. It would become known as Bloody Sunday. "13 innocent people were shot dead by the Parachute Regiment that day. It took 2 public inquiries and many millions of pounds before the British government accepted that the killings were entirely unjustified. But that was a conclusion obvious to eyewitnesses like Father Edward Daly.
Can you tell me what happened when the paratroopers came in, Father?
They came in and they just came in firing. The people, there was no provocation whatsoever.
Firing what, rubber bullets?
No, it was lead bullets they fired. They seemed to fire in all directions. It was completely outrageous, disgraceful. I don't know. They call themselves an army. It's utterly disgraceful.
Are you quite sure that nothing was fired at them first?
There was nothing fired at them, sir. I'm absolutely certain of that. I can speak of this without any difficulty whatsoever because I was there.
A short while ago, we filmed you leading the way with a white handkerchief.
Yes.
For a party who were carrying a boy who was dead or dying. Now, how was he shot?
That little boy was shot when he was running away. He was just a little bit behind me when he fell. I heard the shot. I looked around. I saw him down.
You saw him?
Yes. And he was shot.
He was a young man, wasn't he?
He was a young boy, I would say about 15, thereabouts.
He didn't have a weapon?
No, he had nothing. He was just a young boy of about 15. He was running. I was running too.
Dennis Bradley, then a young priest, also saw the aftermath.
I remember feeling, I don't know how this is going to happen, but I know that life's going to be different from here on in. Bloody Sunday changed everything. The IRA couldn't handle the number of people that they were being offered, were offering themselves to join the Republican movement.
In Dublin, the British Embassy was set alight in front of a crowd of many thousands. Nationalist Ireland was up in arms.
Now the whistle's going now.
Yes. Now what's happening?
Pressure was building for London to take direct control. Brian Faulkner went to see the British Prime Minister Ted Heath in London, accompanied by his private secretary.
After the meeting, Faulkner said, "Do I have your support or not?" And Heath put his arm around him and he said, "Brian, I'm with you all the way."
Did Heath betray him?
Well, in terms of that conversation, yes.
The Northern Ireland regime seemed powerless to stop the decaying security situation.
This is a moment that had been feared for a long time, an assassination attempt on a member of the government.
In February, the Home Affairs Minister barely survived a gun attack by a separate wing of the IRA.
How many times were you shot?
10 times, 10 bullets.
Where were you shot?
Oh, one through the hand, here's still a mark there. one across over the heart, and 8 here. This is I lost a good bit of my jaw. This is now part of my leg. They took it out of the hip. A great bit of work by the Ulster Hospital.
You're extraordinarily lucky to survive.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I had a great surgeon, and he said to me a month later, "John, any other person would have died, but you had great reserves." He said anyone who's very thin wouldn't have survived your experience.
Strengthened in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, the IRA looked to bomb Stormont out of existence. Time after time, their bombs claimed the lives of civilians, Protestant and Catholic. Outrage at such attacks would not deflect their campaign. This is rare footage of IRA members assembling a car bomb in Derry. It is unique, not just because very few people have ever seen it, but because of who features in it. One of the IRA's emerging leaders has a starring role.
There's a huge charge there. A very dangerous alarm clock timer that could blow them all to hell.
Who do you recognise?
Who do I recognise? Well, there's Martin.
Who is the person you're referring to as Martin?
Martin McGuinness.
Are you certain that's him?
I'm certain that he's filmed at the end there, walking across the back of the car. Yeah. Nobody walks like him with a stoop on his back and so on. Yeah.
Martin McGuinness, who would later sit at the head of a Northern Ireland government, was about to help bring down an earlier Northern Ireland government. The bomb car can be identified by the number plate. "30 minutes later, this was the centre of Derry. The number plate in the wreckage matches the bomb car. The next day, March the 22nd, 1972, Brian Faulkner was brought to London to be told by the British Prime Minister that Stormont would be stripped of security powers. Faulkner and his entire cabinet resigned.
I was very sad about it, actually. I mean, probably the only time in my civil service career I shed tears. One had tried very, very hard to stave off this kind of calamity. And now, as it were, the whole devolution experiment was being written off, at any rate, for the time being. So I felt it personally,
What was the feeling?
Oh, depression, the situation just got worse and worse, and this was the final calamity.
Home Affairs Minister John Taylor left hospital to join a show of defiance.
The Ulster Hospital is not too far from Stormont. So I was driven to Stormont, and Brian Faulkner put me in pride of place right beside him on the balcony. I think Brian wanted me to experience the event because it was a massive demonstration of unionism, and unionism rejecting British rule.
We feel that we have been betrayed from London.
The end of unionist political control would bring a surge in killings by loyalist groups like the UVF. For the IRA, the fall of Stormont was a sure and certain sign that they were winning. Their war had ended Unionist rule. Britain's time in Ireland appeared to be running out.
Do you remember that moment, when you heard
Oh,
it?
God, I do. It was a great achievement, actually. Stormont was gone. One of the planks in the thing was gone, and I always thought that was great.
That's the way we thought, this is over. We're going to get, the Brits are going to pull out. Okay, there'll be trouble for a few years or two. We can handle that and we get our United Ireland. But sure, we're still looking for it.
As the British government moved to take charge, the IRA could boast of controlling sections of Belfast and in particular Derry. In the Bogside and Cregan areas, they policed the streets, not the security forces. In Free Derry, they even had their own Che Guevara.
It's Mark McGuinness. Very young, tall, handling weapons, a rifle and a revolver, rolling up to a load of kids who are staring in the windows and craning in the windows, and he's showing them bullets. It's horrific, really, because here was McGuinness and others showing 8, 9 and 10-year-olds, guns and bullets that were exciting. People had a feeling that we were on television, They were superstars,
It was the spring of 1972. Stormont was gone. The civil rights campaign was a memory. The phony IRA campaign by Ian Paisley's supporters had yielded to real and ferocious IRA attacks. Britain had committed more than 15,000 soldiers to Northern Ireland, supported by the locally recruited Ulster Defence Regiment and the RUC. And yet, the conflict raged. General Sir Michael Carver was worried. We have discovered this top-secret assessment he wrote at that time, so sensitive it was shown to only one cabinet minister. In it he said that since the collapse of Stormont, the IRA had strengthened its military position while his own soldiers were losing the military initiative. General Carver proposed a lasting solution. Astonishingly, he said it must lie in a way that Britain can escape the commitment to the border. The most senior officer in the British Army was recommending a united Ireland. Less than 3 years after Britain committed troops to the streets, the IRA appeared to be on the verge of victory.
And the series continues next Tuesday night at 9. Details of organisations offering information and support are available at bbc.co.uk/actionline, or you can call for free at any time to hear recorded information on 08000 933 193.